All right. Hi, I'm Jasmine, and I am not a preacher, but I am a teacher, and I was a teacher for 10 years. I taught middle school, which was my favorite grade. I really relate to precocious and awkward people who say what they think, say the first thing that comes to mind. So that's me. And I'm also a writer. I wrote Mother to Son. I also wrote a book that came out in 2021 called Carved in Ebony, Lessons from the Black Women That Shape Us. And it was basically, when I wrote Mother to Son, I had an entire chapter in that book, which is Letters to My Son, about race and justice. And the chapter was about why representation matters, why stories of black Christians who have gone before us matter. And every time somebody would come up to me and talk to me about Mother to Son, they would be like, oh my goodness, I love that chapter about representation. You talked about Mariah Fearing, you talked about George Lyle, you talked about a couple of other names. Where can I learn more about them? And I never really had an answer. So I'm a huge nerd, so I'm always on like JSTOR and looking at academic articles. I read other people's dissertations for fun. And so that's where I would learn about these people. And so I decided to write a popular level book about some of the women that I was learning about. And my one litmus test for the women that were included in the book is that I could never have heard of them before I sat down to write the book. When I was a kid, I read, I don't know if you guys are familiar, so I'm very much a millennial. And my book collection, yes. My book collection consisted of those Dear America diaries. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Yes, okay. So, like, my favorites were like Donner Party and Titanic. Like, it's giving suffering, right? It's giving like drama, intrigue. And I also really liked those white, I think they're like Banner of Truth biographies. They had like Amy Carmichael and George Lyle and Mary Slessor and all of these amazing missionaries. And I think they had one about Sojourner Truth, and that was the one black woman who was in the entire series. And so I really wanted to find the stories that I loved, but also find the stories that I loved that had people in them who love the Lord, were doing great things for Him, and were also black and also women. And so that's how Carved in Ebony was born. One of the very first women that I decided to write about was Mariah Fearing. And she's incredible, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So, Mariah Fearing was born in Alabama. Yes. She was born into slavery in 1838, July 26, 1838. And she was enslaved by a Presbyterian pastor's family. And so the big thing with this family was they were all about catechism, discipleship for their children, as well as for the children that were enslaved in their household. And as somebody who studies a lot about slavery, whenever I tell this story, I always run into a couple of people who are like, oh, so they treated her like family. And I'm like, can your family leave when they want to leave? Can your own kids learn how to read if they want to learn how to read? Are there laws barring you from teaching your children certain things? So even though the family treated her kindly, she was still very much enslaved, to the extent that she wasn't freed until the Civil War was over in 1865. She started working at a school in Alabama that was set up by the Freedmen's Bureau, and what she wanted more than anything was to learn how to read. So there's this 30-year-old woman who is sitting in a classroom full of children, humbling herself to learn how to read because it was really important for her personally to learn how to read the Bible. So she works at the school from the age of 30 to the age of 56. She saves up enough money to buy her own home by working and teaching at that school and other schools in the area. And you would think Mariah's life is pretty set. But then she meets William Henry Shepherd. He is a black missionary to the Congo. He comes and he speaks at the school, and Mariah is spellbound. She wants nothing more than to go overseas, go to the Congo, become a missionary. She goes to the Missionary Association and she says, here I am, send me. And they say, 56 is really old. We're not going to be able to finance your journey. Pray for us and give it up. She does not give it up. She sells her home. She gets money from other people. She raises money to go overseas, and she goes to Congo. And my parents live in Zambia, which is really close to Congo, and it is such a long trip. They're wanting me to come visit them. They're begging me to come visit them to bring. I have three boys. I have 6, 4, and an 18-month-old. And my parents are like, oh, we want you to come, this summer. And I'm like, that is a 27-hour flight. Like, it's a 27-hour journey. And I think I'm imagining myself sitting in an airplane with my 4-year-old climbing on top of my head and my 18-month-old, like, clinging to me. And 27 hours is such a long time. And back to the point of me being a millennial, because Mariah literally got on a ship and like sailed across the sea, and then Congo is inland, so she had to go 1,200 miles inland, and that meant like being carried on top of these. So there's like four men, and they all have a different like side of this bed, and so 1,200 miles through the forest. She's being carried on top of this thing. She's 57 years old at this point. She's being rocked back and forth all the way through the jungle, because that's how important it is for her to have this mission. Okay, so that's Mariah, and that's what Mariah is doing. But the Congo is actually occupied at this point by King Leopold of Belgium. Has anybody heard of King Leopold of Belgium? Okay, so I hadn't heard of him either, which is crazy because he was responsible for the death of an estimated 10 million people in Congo through his reign in Belgium. Belgium has, Belgium is a really tiny country. It's like not one of the cool countries. And Leopold really wanted it to be a cool country. So he decided that he was going to colonize, because that's what everybody else is doing. That's what all the cool kids were doing in the 1800s. And so in 1865, right as the Civil War is ending, Leopold discovers Belgium, and he's like, discovers Congo, and he's like, this is the perfect place for Belgium to go set up camp, and they have all kinds of natural resources, but the resource that Leopold is really interested in is their rubber. And working in rubber mines is treacherous work. It is terrible work. So Leopold's like, I'm not gonna send Belgian people to work in the rubber mines. It's cool because this country that I just discovered has all of these people in it that can be enslaved and work in the mines. And so that's what he does. People die in mining accidents, sure, but they also die because Leopold decides that he's going to amass an army of people who are willing to oppress other Congolese people. So there's these Congolese soldiers. They have guns, they have weapons, they have all kinds of things, but they're not allowed to use these weapons or discharge these guns without bringing back proof that they discharged them against other people. And why is that? Leopold's like, I'm gonna give you bullets, but I don't want you to be hunting game. I know you're starving. I don't want you to be feeding your families. I know you're hungry. I really wanna make sure that every time that you use a bullet, you're using it to kill a person, not an animal. So what I want you to do is I want you to bring back a hand or an arm to prove to me that you have killed a person and not an animal. So they hunt animals, and then they go find people, and they remove limbs. One of the reasons that I don't have visuals is because a lot of the pictures of William Henry Shepherd in the Congo are with young men who are missing limbs, because these Congolese soldiers are trying to feed themselves, and they have to show proof of killing other people to feed themselves. And so a lot of the pictures of William Shepherd and a lot of the pictures of the other people in the Congo mission involve kind of those gruesome scenes that we're talking about. So that's what Mariah steps into. And the thing about this woman that I love so much is that she was a teacher and a domestic worker back in America. She was like, this is what I know how to do. So she comes to Congo, she sets up the Pantops Home for Girls, and the entire purpose of it is to teach young women all the domestic skills that she learned in America, to teach them to read, to teach them to write, to give them everything that she has to give them. She is living in the middle of this completely war-torn nation that Leopold is just gutting for all that it's worth. And she is involved in this enterprise that involves saving children from being murdered, from being dismembered. And oftentimes the most important thing to Mariah was that she was keeping a clean house, keeping a neat environment, keeping a healthy environment, keeping a home for these girls that felt stable and felt normal. She's doing incredibly heroic things like trading a pound of salt for the life of a child. But she's doing it in the same spirit of domestic work that she's been doing back at home. Mariah worked in the Congo until she was 78 years old. She gave 20 years of her life to Congo. She worked there even after Leopold had left. What I love about her story the most is that even after she went home at the age of 78, she didn't stop. She lived to be 99 and she taught every day of her life until she was 99 years old. She taught every day of her life until she died. It was really important for her to continue to pour into the next generation the things that she missed out on, the things that she wasn't able to take advantage of. Whenever I tell the story of Mariah or people like her who were born in a country that says that it prizes Christianity, that says that it prizes the gospel, but treated her and people like her in such dehumanizing ways, I get the question, how? Why? Why would somebody who was enslaved in this country by people professing Christianity then take the religion of their enslavers and deliver it to other nations? And I thought about that question long and hard. It has a lot of answers. One of the major answers, of course, is that Christianity is not a white man's religion. It is not this country's religion. Christianity got to Africa before it ever got to America or Europe because geography. But I really think that I think our country is just so good at PR sometimes that we forget that, right? Like we think Christian nation is defined by our nation and defined by the Christianity as it was lived out in this nation. I've heard it called like religion externalized, like this nation and the way that we built it on principles of liberty and principles of justice. That's the real Christianity, and slavery is just kind of a blip on the screen. So one answer that we could give would be, they saw that the Christianity lived out here was like pretty good, but they could live it out better, right? I know that I am not here to talk to you about slave narratives, but I have a hobby. It's kind of a weird hobby. I like to read slave narratives and mine them for sick burns. It makes me happy. So when I read a slave narrative and I hear somebody just talk about like the state of America, I'm like, oof, write that down. So I've amassed a few sick burns for you. My favorite ones. So the one that I quote the most often is from Frederick Douglass. He wrote his narrative and everybody loved it, but they were kind of like, Frederick, you were a little bit hard on Christianity. Do you love Jesus? And he was like, I'm so glad you asked. I'm so happy to clarify. What I have said, respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is a necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. He goes on to call it the women-whipping, cradle-plundering Christianity of the South. That's Frederick, though, right? Like, he's kind of known for being this really articulate, like, kind of esoteric, above-the-rest kind of person. Okay, so Henry Box Brown, who literally put himself in a 3-foot by 2-foot box and mailed himself to freedom to escape slavery in Virginia, said, I have no apology whatever to make for what I have said in regard to the pretended Christianity under which I was trained while a slave. I felt it my duty to speak of it harshly because I have felt its blasting influence and seen it used as a cloak under which to conceal the most foul and wicked deeds. Maybe he was just grumpy after being in the box. Lewis Hughes says, the slaves on some places gathered in the yard, at others in the white folk schoolhouses, and they all seemed pleased and eager to hear the word of God. It was a strong evidence of their native intelligence and discrimination that they could discern the difference between the truths of the word and the professed practice of those truths by their masters. Henry Bibb, whose wife was sold away from him. During my life in slavery, I have been sold by professors of religion several times. Is this Christianity? Is it honest or right? Is it doing as we would be done by? Is it in accordance with the principles of humanity or justice? I believe slaveholding to be a sin against God and man under all circumstances. I have no sympathy with the person or persons who tolerate and support the system, willingly and knowingly, morally, religiously, or politically. David West. I look upon slavery as a disgrace and as breaking the laws of God, that no man can keep the law of God and hold to slavery. I believe my own master was as good a man as there is in the whole South. I love him in health, and I loved him in death, but I can read the Bible, and I do not see anywhere by which he could be justified in holding slaves, and I do not know where he has gone to. Lastly, William Craft. William and Ellen Craft have an amazing story. I just finished a book about it called, I think it's called Master, Slave, Husband, Wife. Ellen was the daughter of a slaveholder, and so she could pass for white, so she disguised herself as a man. And William pretended to be her slave, and they made it from Georgia to Philadelphia on trains, like in this disguise, and it was perilous and it was amazing. Both of them really loved the Lord and spoke of him often. William often spoke about Christianity. He said, "My master also sold a dear brother and sister in the same manner as he did my father and mother. The reason he assigned for disposing of my parents, as well as of several other aged slaves, was that they were getting old and would soon become valueless in the market, and therefore he intended to sell off all the old stock and buy in a young lot. A most disgraceful conclusion for a man to come to who made such great professions of religion. This shameful conduct, can you still hear me? This shameful conduct gave me thorough hatred, not for true Christianity, but for slaveholding piety." The reason why I think it's really important to share the words from those narratives when we're talking about Mariah is because her enslavement didn't happen in a vacuum. She was from Alabama, as I said. I live in Mississippi. Kind of these hotbeds, right, for the enslavement that is going on in America, the heart of the South, the heart of this worldview that holds piety in one hand and holds the systemic dehumanization of Black bodies during the slave trade in the other hand. They called it their peculiar institution. I remember once I was talking to somebody, and I was like, it's crazy how the Bible Belt is basically just the Confederacy. And she was like, unpack that for me. And I was like, well, okay, so on a map, this is the Confederacy. Anyway, the map. Yes. There was such a high concentration of piety and cruelty. When Ida B. Wells was talking in England about the lynching that was going on American soil, she said that maybe the white folks of the South were too busy saving souls to care about Black bodies. And those words have always stuck with me because I am a Christian. I love the Lord. And I grew up in predominantly white environments. I grew up in very white evangelical spaces. My dad was a pastor at a church where most people did not look like me. I was also homeschooled. Are there any homeschoolers out there? Yes. But I was like the culty kind of homeschooled. So y'all are probably like the normal kind of homeschooled. I was like imagine if this was a dress instead of some overalls and I had on some Keds. I was that kind of homeschooled. And we would always talk about heroes of the faith, right? And we'd always talk about the founding fathers. We talk about Jonathan Edwards. We talk about George Whitefield. We talk about all of these folks who said things that were very pious, but were also involved in the slave trade in different ways. Jonathan Edwards wrote a sermon on the back of a bill of sale for an enslaved person. George Whitefield brought slavery into Georgia, which was not even a slave state, because he wanted to be able to build an orphanage cheaply. Instead of being taught to grapple with those things, I was more so taught to just kind of like, oh, well, okay, but nobody's perfect. Okay, well, nobody's good. It's fine. But what I've come to terms with as an adult, and again, I'm not putting anybody in hell. I'm not putting anybody in heaven. I don't want anybody doing that to me. But what I am saying is a lot of times we have these heroes, we have these examples, and I think that a conference like this and a space like this is so important because we can broaden our perspective of what a good example is. We have more choices. We have more options. We have more people who are living in accordance with God's word, even in these areas that we've been taught to overlook, even in these areas that we've been taught are less important. So as somebody who works a lot with primary sources, who works a lot with slave narratives, who works a lot with speeches and stories, Mariah Fearing is an interesting case because she does not have any published speeches. She does not have a published biography, autobiography. It was really hard to find a paper trail from this woman. She just was like talking less and doing more. But I ended up being able to find the one biography about her that had been written at the time. There's more coming, and I'm so excited about that. And it was written by Althea Edmiston, who was another Black woman who was at the Congo mission with Mariah Fearing. Althea and Alonzo had several children. They all lived in the Congo and worked there together. And she observed Mariah and wrote about her in this little biography. And to write this book, I did so much work to just kind of I was just on eBay all the time trying to find things as cheaply as possible. I was just kind of looking as an independent researcher and as somebody who's not a part of the academy, just trying to figure it out. And I ended up being able to find a copy of that biography, and a friend of mine who works at the Edmiston Center in Atlanta ended up buying it, and I went to see it. And I am not super comfortable with showing my emotions. I'm just like, oh, cry. No, sarcasm instead. And so I went and, I was like, oh, this is so cool. And I opened it and I read the first page and I cried. And I was like, this is weakness leaving the body. Oh no. But something that Althea said about Mariah in the beginning of her entire story stuck with me. She said, what could this woman of 56 years and less than a high school education do in the darkest of all the continents where she would be compelled to learn the unwritten language of the native people? What could she do? What could she offer? What could this woman who was born into slavery in a country that did not value her or her humanity offer to a quote unquote dark continent? I'll tell you what she offered, but first, I want to tell you the fact that she was also from a dark continent. It is dark to enslave men, women, and children. It is dark to separate families. It is dark to proclaim to be a nation founded on liberty and justice for all and only offer liberty and justice to a few. We think of Africa as this dark and unreached cesspool so often. First of all, we think about it as if it's like a state and not a continent that's big enough to swallow all the other continents. But we think about the countries in Africa as though they are these dark and unreached places, right, where devilment reigns. What greater devilment is there than to separate a crying baby from their mother? What greater devilment is there than to rip apart husbands from their wives? What greater devilment is there than to say, this is what godly womanhood looks like. These women are supposed to be protected and pure and secure, and then to cause Black women to live in terror. So she went from a dark place to another dark place. That's the first correction that I would offer to Althea. But she went from this country where literacy was actually illegal for her to another country where she helped to translate the Bible into that language. Because she understood the difference between what her country purported to be godliness and what was actual godliness. She did not judge God by the standards of the people that she was surrounded with. She understood the standard from the Bible. In fact, at the age of 30, she submitted herself in a classroom of children to learn about the godliness that is in the Bible. She wanted to read so that she could understand what God had to say. And she looked and she found it. I think that so often in our present day, which is never my favorite thing to talk about, I'm like, keep it historical, 200 years ago, let's go. But in our present day, if I had to come up with an application, I would say that so often when we look at the media, we look at how Christians are portrayed, how Christians respond to certain things, how the media kind of panders to this side or that side or whatever. It can be so easy to look at the American church and talk about the American church as though she's the center of the universe. So to be like, oh yeah, Christianity is just not good at X, or Christianity has really failed at Y. When what we really mean is that the American church has been complicit in some pretty terrible things, but the American church is not Christianity. The American church has bred a lot of hypocrisy, but the American church does not define who God is. And I think that one of the major ways that we can look back and that we can understand that is to look back at stories like Mariah's, stories about women who really lived at the nadir of racial relations in this country and still devoted their lives to service to God, devoting their lives to bringing light in the darkness, both here and abroad. And that's why her story is extremely important to me and why I really hope that you guys will learn more about her too. Mariah died when she was 99. She died with always enough funds in her bank account to go back to Congo just in case. And right before her death, when Althea Brown Edmiston wrote her biography, she said, "She has been modest, faithful, conscientious, and devoted. She has been universally kind and loving in times of need, and all of us will miss her gentle ministrations of love and thoughtfulness. But above all, we believe that her work will not only live in the lives of the girls she has trained in the Pantops home, but it will endure through many generations and their descendants." And I am here 100 years later to tell you that it has endured and that it should endure, and that there are so many more stories like hers to mine and to share, and that they show us so much about who God is and what he thinks about the people that he made in his image. And I hope that you guys will continue to find them. Thank you.